Welcome to this Tutor to You topic video on global development, looking at theoretical approaches to globalization. While sociologists are in general agreement that society has undergone a process of globalization over the last 30 years, not all sociologists agree that this is necessarily beneficial to society. As with many social changes in society, there are perspectives that welcome the change, whilst others are critical of the impacts of a change such as globalization. There are different approaches to globalization, often linked into other theories of development, and how the social and economic changes that have accompanied globalization impact on society and the process of development. Those favouring a more global society are neoliberal views, often referred to as hyper-globalist perspectives, who view globalization positively, in part due to the breakdown of trade barriers and increased global consumption patterns. Other theorists are more critical, such as pessimistic globalism, that sees globalization not as a merging of cultures, but rather the imposition of Western culture on other societies, a process referred to as cultural imperialism. Marxist theories also take a critical view of globalization, particularly that of Wallerstein's world systems theory, which we've examined earlier in this series when looking at theories of development. Finally, a middle ground in the debate over whether globalization is positive or negative is put forward by transformationalists, those adopting a postmodern view of society, and how many people choose aspects of globalization with which to identify. In this video, we're going to look at each of these perspectives in turn. Firstly, hyperglobalism. Hyperglobalists have an optimistic view of the process of globalization, seen as having many benefits for society and in particular development. Sen argues that the greater international cooperation between technology and scientific communities gives us greater access to advancements in these areas and helps us to solve global issues. For example, international cooperation in the manufacture of COVID vaccines and the growth of communications networks such as the internet. Hyperglobalists suggest that this has been enabled by the adoption of neoliberal economic policy, particularly free trade, as it removes economic barriers and lessens state ownership, enabling TNCs to work across borders and promote innovative solutions to global issues. This helps provide the developing world with opportunities for social and economic growth, as TNCs are able to use these advancements in tackling problems in different nations. Finally, hyperglobalists see the adoption of free trade as a way in which nations can develop and prosper economically. Global culture has created global demand for goods and services, and this provides developing nations with opportunities to produce these goods and export them to the consumer markets, particularly in the West. However, critics of this approach suggest that this leads to exploitation, with many developing nations being seen as low-wage economies and thus ripe for TNCs to exploit cheap labour and increase their profit margins. Another globalist approach doesn't see globalisation as having brought the benefits that hyperglobalists suggest. Instead, pessimistic globalists take a critical view of the process of globalisation, arguing that rather than the emergence of a truly global culture, instead there has been a form of cultural imperialism that enforces Western values onto nations in the developing world. And this can be seen through approaches such as modernization theory and how social engineering is used to promote ideas of meritocracy, entrepreneurialism, and individualism into the developing world. Pessimistic globalists see this mass global culture of consumerism and adopting a homogeneous approach to society as being responsible for the end of indigenous folk cultures, as mass marketing and Western consumer goods become desirable in parts of the developing world. This is reinforced through the adoption of neoliberal economic policies that allow TNCs to trade in nations to expand the markets available for their products, and pessimistic globalists argue that developing nations are unable to reject free market policies. This is because international governmental organisations stipulate that if developing nations want aid, they must adhere to strict conditions, what are called structural adjustment policies, and these stipulate free trade and privatisation of industries. This has led to the world becoming more similar, or to put it another way, more Western. Ritzer argues that society has undergone a process of McDonaldization, whereby goods and services can be produced in a standardized and de-skilled way anywhere in the world, which has created employment opportunities in the developing world in low-paid, low-skilled jobs. Individuals will follow a specific template of how to produce goods that is the same in multiple global locations. Furthermore, Barber and Schultz argue that there has been a Disneyfication of society, transforming society into a safe and commercial enterprise for individuals to consume without risk. World system theory also views globalization with suspicion. Wallerstein's theory identifies an economic motive for change behind the process for globalization, one which separates nations into three distinct tiers of the modern world system. This is organized into a basic hierarchy, with core nations at the top able to exploit the cheap labor and resources of the periphery and semi-peripheral nations, while simultaneously they benefit from sales of high-value consumer goods to these markets. Similarly, the semi-peripheral nations, newly industrialized nations, can exploit the peripheral nations in the same way. Unlike traditional Marxist theories, Wallerstein's world system theory examines how nations might move from the periphery to the semi-periphery, or alternatively fall from being a core nation to semi-peripheral. Globalization has allowed this hierarchy to exist, with a race to the bottom, a desire to find even cheaper labour and resources motivating nations to exploit one another. This has been facilitated by the process of globalization, whereby TNCs are able to exploit nations in the periphery who are desperate for overseas investment. However, it is rare that this investment produces an increase in economic output for the nations, with the majority of profits returning to the TNCs rather than nation-states. This, in a true Marxist sense, leads to alienation and exploitation of those in peripheral nations, a result of the opening of markets fueled by globalization. Finally, transformationalists. Their view is a middle ground between the more critical and optimistic views already presented. As a postmodern approach, they see that the process of globalization has led to people and nations having the ability to pick and choose elements of Western culture to adopt. By no means has globalization gone unchallenged in society, with the rise of nationalism and religious fundamentalism being a result of increased globalization in society. But instead of blindly accepting or rejecting a global culture, individuals adopt elements of global culture and develop hybrid identities. For example, in the United Arab Emirates, which, despite adopting Western consumerism and leisure patterns, maintains strict adherence to Islamic law and Arabic culture. This globalization, adopting global elements to local cultures, can be seen in other parts of the world too, even in the West, with a rise in nationalist agendas in politics, yet maintaining global trade patterns. This can also be seen through the spread of democratic ideas in parts of the world with authoritarian rule. In the spring of 2011, there were many popular uprisings against authoritarian rule, whilst current protests for improvement to women's rights in Iran can be linked to a greater desire for democratic rule in the region, whilst not wanting to conform to Western ideas. This demonstrates the pick and mix nature of globalization, something postmodernists highlight. That concludes this Tutor to You Sociology topic video on global development, looking at theories of globalization. Thanks for watching.